Hi, my name is John Gagain, and welcome to our program, Capitol Report, broadcasting to you live here from the U.S. House of Representatives here in Washington, D.C. Today's topic is a very important one. Can Congress do better? What better congressman to speak about that issue than Congressman Henry Cuellar here from Texas's 28th District. How are you, Congressman Cuellar?
John, how are you?
Good. Good to see you. Good to converse with you here on the program. As we mentioned, today's topic is, can Congress do better? We'll discuss that for 20 some odd minutes. And it'll be our opportunity to connect with the constituents in your district. We know that many of them are concerned and always want to know, what can our legislators do better for us here in Texas from Washington? So first I'd like to start, who is Henry Cuellar? What's your story?
My father, my mother were migrant workers. I'm the oldest of 8 kids. My father and mom went only to a 3rd to a 6th grade education. They worked hard. They didn't have a lot of money. They had a lot of love, and they told us that the best way to, even though they were not able to get an education, was to get an education. So I'm an individual that believes a lot in education, and this is where I learned from my parents how to work hard, how to get good education, and always do the right thing.
You know, I think you have a fascinating story, especially now with the immigration reform on the floor of the Congress and the Senate and even in the House now. And I've heard many people talk about you and where your parents have come from and how far you've come and how many degrees you have. I think it's really a fascinating story that you have. So it's great I'm fairly new to Congress, as you know. So it's always good to hear your story, and I'm sure that many Texans are inspired by it and what you've done as a leader here in Washington. On that note, I know you take a lot of pride in being a congressman. I've seen you shake hands of many different leaders here in the halls of Washington, D.C. I've seen many pictures of you doing what you do in Texas with your people at the local level, and it's really impressive. But while a congressman like you, a representative of your people, is so dedicated and so enthusiastic about what he does, at the same time Congress has low approval ratings. So at times it must feel frustrating even for yourself. And one good example is last week you were briefing the Land O'Lakes executives over in the Senate, Dirksen building. And one of them asked a question, particularly, can Congress do better? And the 3 points that this leader of the Land O'Lakes group, the executive, mentioned was that Congress has become more partisan. That the moderate center has become more decimated. And third, he mentioned that the rural Democrats are disappearing. We're going to go to a pause now to hear some messages from our station partners. But when we come back, I'd like to play a clip of how you responded to that question.
That's what's happening right now, is that you're having districts that are becoming too Republican or too Democratic, and the folks in the middle are just being squeezed. And when you take that away, then the art of compromise, the art of getting together is disappearing, and that's not good for the system. I mean, when some people say, I can't use the word compromise because it's an ugly word. I mean, look at the founding fathers. I mean, the factions that we had. The Madison. Look at what James Madison used to talk about, the factions itself there, and that's what the founding fathers was built on. What our country was built on by the founding fathers. Having this debate, but unfortunately, as you know, it's becoming more partisan, which is again not good for our country itself.
Congressman Henry Cuellar, it seems the word compromise has fallen off the radar screen of many members here in Washington. Are you worried about that?
Yes, I am, because when you look at a country like the United States, the northern, the southern, the eastern, the western, the Midwest, also you have different interests. People represent different populations, different geographical locations. So when we all meet in Congress, we got to get all those interests together in one room and then compromise or work out a consensus so we can get things done. when you take a look at the process, that's the way the process should be working on. Unfortunately, right now, some people don't want to compromise. They're saying it's my way or the highway, and that just doesn't work that way, because whoever the majority might be at the House is the one that controls what happens here, and we need to make sure that we also include Democrats, Republicans, the minority, the majority members here, so we can get things done. Otherwise, we're going to just have gridlock, which is not good for the country.
That's an interesting current day perspective. At the same speech at Land O'Lakes, you mentioned something very important. You alluded to the founding fathers. You mentioned this wasn't how it was when the founding fathers were here operating in Congress. I found that historical perspective to be very important, as if Congress were once different. Different as in putting the nation first and not the party first. In Congress speak, they say to not be partisan or to be bipartisan, which you also address. So I would say that so many, not only in your district, but in many districts, constituents, people at the local level, families, they want to know why. They want to know, why is compromise a bad word? Why were things different the days of the founding fathers versus today? You made a good point during the Land O'Lakes speech to the executives. You made mention to a conversation you had with your colleague and chairman of the House Appropriations Committee, Congressman Hal Rogers from Kentucky. Let's take a pause to go to a message from the station's partners. When we get back, we'll listen to what you said.
Why is this, what's happened to Congress? What happened to the old days where people could sit down and talk and have a discussion? They always use Reagan and Tip O'Neill, where they can go out and talk. But what happened was, this is what he said, I thought it was very insightful. He said, one, the airplane, he gave the reasons. Airplane, rule changes, and TV. He says, in the old days when there were no airplanes, congressmen would come here and they couldn't just, I couldn't fly home to Texas like I do every week. After the last vote, I fly back to Texas. So you would bring your family, you would stay here, you spend time with other members, you get to know them, you get to know their families. And once you get to know somebody, it's hard to call them a son of a gun, right? Because you get to know that individual. Here we come in and we fly back. A lot of times we only recognize people with this little button right here. That's it. And if you look at it, the last 6 years, we got, I think half of the Congress is new. I mean, there's been big changes that we've seen here. Number one, the airplane. Number two was the rule changes. Now what happens is, instead of doing a lot of voice vote, hey, we got this, let's voice, oh, you know what? I'm going to put this amendment, we're going to ask for a record vote to put the other side on the record to make the other person look bad. Okay? Rule change. Everything becomes a record vote, almost everything, in committee and on the floor. The other thing was the camera, right? Because now, instead of talking to members on the House floor or in committee, who are they talking to? They're looking at the camera and they're talking to the audience outside that room or outside that member itself.
Congressman Henry Cuellar, besides the airplane, the rule changes, and television, you mentioned another possible challenge obstructing our bipartisan cooperation here in Congress. Could you talk a little bit about that?
It's what I call the window of opportunity to get things done before the next election arrives. For example, this year, we have time to work on some of the major pieces of legislation this year. And if we wait too long into the end of this year or even the beginning of next year, the election cycle of 2014 will come in, and therefore things just really stop here in Washington. Then after that, you have the election of 2016, and we know what happens when a presidential election comes in. So we have windows of opportunity to get things done. Then after that, the election cycle comes in, and it just stops things, or things become hyper partisan here. So you have the airplane, you have the rule changes, you have the TV, and you have the window also.
It's funny you mentioned 2016. There's elections for congressmen like yourself next year, 2014. 2016's on the horizon. It seems like we're always in an election. So our constituents say, hey, you're always in an election. When do you legislate? When do you work and bring home benefits for us here in Texas? We pay our taxes. We do what we need to do. We support our families, and we want to see what Washington's doing for us. But it's funny you mentioned 2016, because some say we seem to have already started the election season for 2016. You hear language, incendiary language, as they say, like the I word. What's the I word? Impeachment.
Mm-hmm.
We heard that from a couple of congressmen, a couple of elected officials here in Washington. The media said last week, with the IRS issue, the Associated Press issue, the Benghazi issue, even issues related to health and human services, that last week was the worst week in the history of President Obama's either first term or both, or second term. How has the political environment, or in your opinion, do you think the political environment here in Washington, if we're asking the question today, can Congress do better? Do you think it's reached an ultimate low? If the media and others are saying that it's reached it's pivotal, it's a bottoming point for President Obama, can it go any lower? And is this window that you're talking about closing really fast?
Well, yes, the window is closing up on that, because I mean the elections are coming up again. Number one. Number two, we're having, when you look at how some of the approval ratings of Congress as a whole, you will see that it might be, 10, 15, I think maybe closer to 15, less than 20%. And sometimes I wonder, who are those 20% that are given as an approval rating? So it's one of those things that that I understand that the American people get frustrated. You can count me among those individuals that also feel frustrated, because I work here. I see things just slow down, become very partisan. And I think that's the thing that the American people don't want to see. What they want is they see a problem, and they want people, both Democrats and Republicans, to sit down and work that problem. Another problem rises, they want to sit down, work that out, come up to a solution.
Don't care. Yeah, they don't care.
Yeah, they don't care. It's like if you have a fire at your house, does it matter if it's a Democrat or Republican that comes and puts out the fire? No.
When the firemen come, you don't ask them what party they're from.
You don't ask them what the party is. You just want the job done. Same thing over here. They want us to get it done. And that's what I'm hoping that we can get back to again. Bipartisan, everybody talks about bipartisan, but if you really look at what happens here, if a Democrat tries to be bipartisan, there'll be attempts to discipline that individual. I've seen Republicans also, when they're bipartisan, you'll see their party discipline that individual. Then, of course, not only on the floor, but you also see that in primaries, where the Republicans go far right because somebody feels that that they're not Republican enough. You see the Democrats also, they get primary also. So you're seeing extremes coming out, and when you see extremes that cannot sit down and work together, that's what makes Congress to a point where it's not functioning correct. We need to get back where we can work together for the good of the country.
It's interesting that you mentioned that there's a political dimension here that maybe Texans in your district on the border with Mexico may not understand. And after you think about it hard and good, you say it is politics, and maybe a lot of it is just more politics and more politics. I've heard you speak eloquently in Washington and Texas about the need to create jobs. This could be, like your metaphor of just putting out the fire. You spoke very eloquently about economic growth, about creating jobs, about economic growth in Texas. So I know you understand the need to really make things happen for your people. So I'm going to ask you a question, and it is it possible for Congress to do better? But before you answer that, I'd like to go back to the tape and show our viewers what you said at this recent Land O'Lakes executives meeting.
Sequestration, that's an example. Remember, there were some people, we got to do the cuts, we got to do this and all that. I think it was a Monday, no, it was a Tuesday. Monday morning, they say, hey, FAA we're going to go ahead and sequester it. It's going to probably delay the airplanes. We fly here on a Tuesday, airplanes are delayed. Thursday night, the Senate quietly passes that flexibility for the FAA. Friday morning, very quietly, the House passes another flexibility for the FAA. Problem solved. We're able to fly back Friday. So if Congress really wanted to do things, they can. We can't. I keep saying they. Sometimes I feel frustrated, just like the American people feel about Congress. But it's one of those things that if we wanted to do things, people could sit down and work these things out.
So, Congressman Cuellar, after listening to that clip of you explain in the short amount of time how the FAA flight delays as a result of sequestration, budget cuts was resolved in the drop of a dime, that's interesting. You know, that you and I've even heard some others mention that when there's a problem, there could be some immediate solution. So when you mentioned that to the Land O'Lakes executives, they got a chuckle out of it, but there is some irony behind it that maybe there is, if you pull out the political element or you really study the problem or solution, you can make Congress better. So thinking about that example that you used, it really hit me here and said maybe there is some serious way to look at these case studies of how you can pass legislation within the matter of a few days and reverse sequestration. So can Congress do better using that example? How would that translate into other things?
Yeah, no, certainly we can certainly do better if we do a couple of things. One, if we come in and we put the interests of the country ahead and say party becomes second. I'm a Democrat, will always say as a Democrat, but if you put party first, and I think it was LBJ, president from Texas, who said, I'm a Democrat, but I will always put country before my party. And I think that's the approach we ought to look at, both as Democrats and Republicans, saying, are we here to vote for a party? Or are we here to vote for the country and for the districts that we represent? And I think if we start off with that premise, then we can get the job done. It's a political environment, I understand that, but it's what you put as your goal. And if you're doing it for the country, then you'll be able to reach that regardless of whatever political environment that we're in.
So what happened in this case of sequestration? There was fights on the floor with the sequestration, and the triggers went in, the automatic budget cuts hit, and then everybody was just waiting, looking at their watches to see what would happen. And then this came with the flight delays. How did that all take place?
Historical background briefly. When 2010 election comes in, folks come in saying, hey, we're going to go ahead and reduce the deficit. Now keep in mind that the deficit has been around for a long time, both under Democratic, Republican administrations. It's been here for a long time. Then in 2010 election, then 2011, we have a debt ceiling fight. And in there, we decided to cut $1.2 trillion over the next 10 years. So we already made of over a $1.2 trillion cuts in there. We also agreed that we're going to cut another $1.2, $1.5 trillion, but we're going to get a super committee together. Democrats, Republicans, senators, House members come in, work an agreement, and we'll cut an additional $1.5 trillion. But if we didn't reach an agreement by the super committee, then the sequester would come in. The sequester is basically automatic cuts designed to be very painful. That is, to get both Democrats and Republicans to reach this agreement. Unfortunately, the super committee didn't come up to an agreement, so sequester comes in. So we're in the first year of sequester. Originally, it was about $115 billion, but then when we had that deal back in December of this last year, we lowered it down to about $87 billion. So it was supposed to be a little bit more painful, but we reduced it down. So that shows you that if we can reduce the sequester down. Keep in mind that this cuts that we had is only the first cut, the first year. There's still year 2, year 3, year 4, year 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So keep in mind that people were talking about the first year. We still got 9 more years to go unless we reach an agreement on this overall $1.5 trillion that we can. We can turn this off anytime we want to, or we can make the deficit cuts in a way that makes more sense. For example, instead of having those automatic cuts without the flexibility, we can still do cuts, but add the flexibility so agencies can decide how to move money around.
What is the difference between the fiscal cliff? When this was all taking place, I remember traveling around Latin America, and even in Latin America, our district borders Mexico, and but I remember that even in Latin America, they were saying el abismo fiscal, the fiscal cliff. So I mean, it's worldwide these notions. So you have the fiscal cliff, the debt ceiling. What are the difference between the two?
Well, basically, to me, the fiscal cliff was a combination of things. I mean, the things that have come up is, one, appropriations. Can you set the yearly budget? And usually what happens is you do a continuing resolution. That means you extend it. You keep everything the same. I was taught in the state of Texas that when you deal with a whole bunch of bills that are introduced in Congress and the state legislature, the most important one is going to be the appropriation, the budget that runs our schools, our transportation, our military defense. Here in Washington, it's the other way. We do with everything, and then we work with the appropriation bills, and they're always extended, number one. The other thing is the debt ceiling. By the debt ceiling, as you know, is when you keep adding the deficit. Keep in mind the deficit is the yearly difference between what comes in and what goes out. The debt is what's accumulated year after year, and it's been accumulating for years and years.
What's it at now?
It's close to $16 trillion.
So and that's how much of what percentage of our GDP?
Too much of our GDP. That's all I can say. But let me also say, to finish your question, is that when you have the debt, it keeps adding. So we have to raise the debt ceiling so we can go ahead and pay the bills that we have. Some folks have said, well, why don't we not just raise the debt ceiling and just keep it the way it is, and that would take care of the deficit. Well, the debt ceiling is like getting a credit card. When you get your credit card bill itself, you don't get your credit card and say, I'm gonna cut it up. You gotta take care of your expenditures at the very beginning, not at the debt ceiling. So that's why it's a complicated issue here that we complicate things where we can, in a very simple way, we can address this thing if we sat down in a bipartisan way to address what comes in, what goes out. That's the bottom at the end, basic economics. What comes in, what goes out.
Congressman, we're going to take a brief pause to go to messages from our station's partners. Hello, John Gagain. We're back here with Congressman Henry Cuellar on Capitol Report, live from Washington, D.C. Congressman, you were speaking about the difference between the fiscal cliff and the debt ceiling and our budget and what's happening with fiscal issues here and at the national level, but also here in Washington in terms of Congress. You mentioned at the Land O'Lakes executives briefing that you gave, the address you gave to them, you used a metaphor to explain the debt ceiling, and you used the credit card. Could you explain that?
Right. Well, the debt is what we're accumulating every year. Keep in mind that every year we raise a certain amount of taxes and fees. That's the revenue coming in. And then whatever we spend on education, Social Security, Medicare, and all that, those are the expenditures. The difference between the expenditures and the income coming in, $3.7 trillion of expenditures, $2.7 trillion of income coming in, that is the deficit, the difference between the income and the expenditures every year. What accumulates every year, that difference right now, is what we call the debt. And that debt has now, over years, both Democrats and Republican administrations, has now grown to $16 trillion. So probably around September or so, we will probably have to go back and say, are we going to raise the debt ceiling so we can pay that debt that we have? And it's gotten out of hand, both under Democrats and Republicans, in the sense that we're paying $200-300 billion a year on just the interest rate. It's a lot of money that we're paying, and keep in mind that a good chunk of it goes off to foreign people own that public debt that we have. So it's something that concerns me both, I think should concern both Democrats and Republicans. But keep in mind, that this is something that has been there under Democrats, Republicans, and this is why we can handle this, take care of this issue as Democrats and Republicans.
So the credit card, if certain congressmen say President Obama wants to extend the debt ceiling, does he want to spend more or comply with the appropriations, the expenditures that we've already committed to?
Yeah, the debt ceiling.
Is it like calling up your...
Yeah, the debt ceiling is the credit card itself, the bill that you get at the end. You spend money at the beginning. When you get the debt ceiling, or when you get the credit card bill, that's the debt ceiling that we have. And some people say, well, go ahead and cut that out. That's going to reduce the deficit. No, if you're going to reduce the deficit, you do it at the very beginning. What you spend, what you what are your expenditures right now? People are looking at this. What's interesting is this. When the debt ceiling, the president has raised the debt ceiling more than anybody in recent history has been Ronald Reagan. He raised it more than anybody. Keep in mind also that it becomes a political issue. When President Bush was there, there was a young senator by the name of Barack Obama who was saying, don't raise the debt ceiling. And Boehner and Eric Cantor were saying, yes, let's do it. Turn it around. Now President Obama is saying we ought to raise the debt ceiling. Now Boehner and Eric Cantor are saying, no, don't do it. So it becomes a political thing. That's not the way you handle your budget.
You know, we started off this show with the topic of can Congress do better? They have a saying, if you want to find out about an issue, follow the money. Mm-hmm. So this show has turned into you explaining our current fiscal situation and what's happening in Congress with sequestration, with the debt ceiling. And I think the voters and the constituents in everyone's district want to know, because they're holding the feet to the fire, your feet to the fire, and other elected officials' feet to the fire. So I think it's very informative. This is a very pivotal issue. And like you say, this is just this cuts of this year, and next year they call it a trigger. And it's like you fire off a shot with this trigger, and then you're telling us there's another bullet coming or another trigger coming. So this is interesting. And your Land O'Lakes speech was very interesting. You can find it on your YouTube channel. They told us in full. But we want to thank you, Congressman Cuellar, for this explanation. You're a very enthusiastic and dedicated congressman, and we appreciate you coming by Capitol Report.
Thank you, John.
Thank you for coming.
It's
a pleasure.
Much.
Thank you, and we'll see you next time on Capitol Report.